The helicopter blades chopped through the thick Afghan air, as Staff Sergeant Mike Torres pressed his hands against the bleeding wound on his leg. The bullet had torn through his thigh during the ambush, and now dark red blood seeped between his fingers, despite the field dressing his teammate had wrapped around it. The pain shot up his spine with every bump and shake of the aircraft, but Mike kept his jaw clenched tight. SEALs didn't cry out, not even when shrapnel from an IED had peppered his shoulder just 2 hours earlier. ETA 5 minutes to base, the pilot's voice crackled through the headset. Mike could see the concern in Lieutenant Rodriguez's eyes across from him, though his commanding officer tried to hide it behind the standard military mask they all wore. The mission had gone sideways fast when their intel proved wrong about enemy positions, and now 3 of his brothers were wounded, with Mike taking the worst of it. The makeshift landing zone at Forward Operating Base Kandahar came into view, a dusty patch of earth surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. Medical personnel were already waiting, their white coats stark against the brown landscape. Mike had been through this routine before, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the amount of blood he'd lost, or maybe it was the way his vision kept going fuzzy around the edges. As the helicopter touched down, the medical team rushed forward. Mike recognized most of the faces: Doc Peterson with his graying beard, Nurse Williams, who always had a joke ready, and Corpsman Jackson, who'd patched him up after the Fallujah incident. But there was someone new among them, someone he hadn't seen before in all his deployments to this godforsaken place. She was small, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail under her medical cap. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she helped transfer him to the stretcher, and Mike noticed how gentle her touch was despite the urgency of the situation. Most medics he'd worked with were former military themselves, big guys who handled wounded soldiers like sacks of grain. This one was different. "Easy there, soldier," she said softly as they carried him toward the medical tent. Her voice had a slight accent he couldn't quite place, maybe Eastern European. "We're going to take good care of you." The field hospital buzzed with controlled chaos. Other wounded soldiers filled nearby beds, some from his unit and others from different missions gone wrong. The smell of disinfectant mixed with dust and blood created an atmosphere Mike knew too well. He'd been a patient here 3 times in the past 2 years, and each time he wondered if this would be the visit that sent him home permanently. The new medic worked alongside Doc Peterson, cutting away his torn fatigues to expose the wounds properly. Mike tried to focus on her movements, anything to distract from the burning sensation as they cleaned the bullet wound. She handled the medical instruments like she'd been doing this for decades, not like someone fresh out of medical school or basic training. "What's your name?" Mike managed to ask through gritted teeth as she started an IV line in his arm. "Sarah," she replied without looking up from her work. "Sarah Chen, and you need to stay still while we get this bleeding under control." There was something in her tone that commanded respect, the kind of authority that came from experience rather than rank. Mike found himself obeying without question, even though he outranked most of the medical staff. Sarah worked with the kind of calm precision he'd only seen in combat veterans, the type who'd been under fire and learned to function when everything around them was falling apart. Doc Peterson stepped away to handle another patient, leaving Sarah to work on extracting the shrapnel from Mike's shoulder. Each piece of metal she pulled out with her tweezers felt like fire, but she moved efficiently, speaking in low, reassuring tones the entire time. "You're doing great," she said as she dropped another piece of twisted metal into the steel pan beside the bed. "This one's deep, but I can see it clearly. Just breathe through it." Mike studied her face as she worked, noticing details he'd missed in the chaos of arrival. There were faint scars along her jawline, the kind that came from glass or shrapnel. Her hands, though gentle with patience, bore calluses that didn't come from holding medical instruments. They were the rough, hardened hands of someone who'd gripped weapons, climbed ropes, and done things that left permanent marks. "Where'd you serve?" Mike asked suddenly, the question popping out before he could stop himself. Sarah's hands paused for just a fraction of a second, so briefly that someone less observant might have missed it. But Mike had spent years reading people, learning to spot tells and reactions that could mean the difference between life and death. "What makes you think I served?" she replied, resuming her work on his shoulder. "Your hands, the scars, the way you move. You're not just medical corps, are you?" This time Sarah did stop, looking up to meet his eyes directly. For a moment, Mike saw something flicker across her expression, a mix of caution, resignation, and something else he couldn't identify. It was the look of someone who'd been carrying secrets for a long time and was tired of the wait. "That's not important right now," she said finally. "What matters is getting you patched up so you can get back to your team." But Mike knew he was right. This wasn't just another medic who'd been assigned to their forward operating base. Sarah Chen was someone with a story, someone with experience that went beyond treating wounded soldiers in a field hospital. The way she handled herself, the confidence in her movements, the command in her voice. These were all signs of someone who'd been on the other side of the medical tent, someone who'd been the one getting patched up rather than doing the patching. As Sarah finished cleaning his wounds and started suturing the worst of the cuts, Mike made a mental note to find out more about the mysterious new medic. In a place where everyone's background was common knowledge and stories spread faster than wildfire, Sarah Chen was an enigma. And in Mike's experience, enigmas in war zones usually meant someone was hiding something important. 3 days later, Mike was back on his feet, though Doc Peterson had ordered him to light duty until his leg healed properly. He'd argued against the restriction, but the medical staff had final say when it came to combat readiness. So instead of going out on missions with his team, he found himself helping around the base, doing maintenance work and equipment checks that kept his hands busy while his mind wandered. He kept thinking about Sarah Chen, the mysterious medic who seemed to appear and disappear from the medical tent like a ghost. Mike had asked around, trying to gather information the way SEALs were trained to do, but nobody seemed to know much about her background. The other medical staff said she'd been transferred in from another base, but the paperwork was classified above their clearance level. That afternoon, while organizing supplies in the armory, Mike spotted Sarah walking across the compound alone. She moved differently than the other medical personnel, who tended to hurry between buildings with their heads down, focused on their next patient or task. Sarah walked with the measured pace of someone constantly scanning for threats, her eyes checking corners and rooftops in patterns Mike recognized from his own training. He decided to follow her, keeping his distance and using the various buildings and supply containers for cover. It wasn't exactly spying, he told himself. Just satisfying professional curiosity about someone who clearly wasn't what she appeared to be. Sarah made her way to the communications building, a restricted area that required special clearance to enter. Mike watched from behind a fuel truck as Sarah approached the guard at the entrance. Instead of showing identification or explaining her purpose, she simply walked up to the soldier and said something Mike couldn't hear. The guard's posture immediately changed from casual alertness to rigid attention, and he stepped aside without checking any paperwork or making any radio calls. That was definitely not normal procedure. Medical personnel didn't have automatic access to classified communications equipment, and guards didn't just wave people through restricted areas without following protocol. Mike's curiosity shifted into something more serious, professional concern about security breaches and potential threats to his team. An hour later, Sarah emerged from the building and headed toward the far edge of the base, near the perimeter fence where the motor pool kept the heavier vehicles. Mike continued following, though he had to be more careful in the open areas where cover was limited. His wounded leg slowed him down, but his SEAL training in surveillance and reconnaissance kept him invisible to casual observation. Sarah stopped at a modified Humvee that had been armored for convoy operations. She circled the vehicle slowly, running her hands along the reinforced panels and checking the mounted weapon systems with the practiced eye of someone who'd used such equipment before. Mike watched as she opened the hood and examined the engine, pointing out specific components to herself like she was conducting some kind of inspection. Then she did something that made Mike's blood run cold. Sarah climbed into the driver's seat and began manipulating the controls with the fluid expertise of someone intimately familiar with military vehicles. She adjusted the mirrors, tested the communications equipment, and even checked the ammunition feeds for the mounted gun, all actions that required training far beyond what any medic would receive. Mike's mind raced through the possibilities. Sarah could be military intelligence, conducting some kind of investigation into base security. She might be from a special operations unit on a classified mission. Or worse, she could be a foreign agent who'd somehow infiltrated their base using medical credentials as cover. His thoughts were interrupted when Sarah suddenly stopped what she was doing and turned to look directly at his hiding spot behind a stack of supply crates. Even from 50 yards away, Mike could see the knowing look in her eyes. She'd spotted him, probably minutes ago, and had been letting him follow her while she decided what to do about it. Sarah climbed out of the Humvee and walked straight toward his position. Mike considered trying to slip away, but his wounded leg wouldn't let him move fast enough, and besides, running would only confirm that he'd been conducting surveillance. Instead, he stood up from his hiding spot and faced her directly. "Enjoying the tour, Sergeant Torres?" Sarah asked as she approached, her voice carrying a mix of amusement and warning. "Just stretching my legs," Mike replied, trying to sound casual despite being caught red-handed. "Doc said I need to stay active to help the healing process." "Uh-huh. And does your physical therapy usually involve following medical personnel around the base and watching them work?" Mike realized there was no point in pretending anymore. Sarah clearly knew he'd been following her, and her calm reaction suggested she'd been in similar situations before. "You're not just a medic," he said simply. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, like she was weighing her options and trying to decide how much truth to tell him. The afternoon sun cast shadows across her features, emphasizing the faint scars Mike had noticed during his treatment. Up close, he could see more details that reinforced his suspicions. A small scar through her left eyebrow, calluses on her trigger finger, and the kind of tan lines that came from wearing body armor in the field. "Walk with me," she said finally, turning away from the motor pool and heading toward a quieter section of the base. They walked in silence for several minutes, past the mess hall and administrative buildings, toward the observation posts that overlooked the valley beyond the base perimeter. Mike's leg throbbed with each step, but he wasn't about to show weakness in front of someone who was clearly evaluating him for something. "You're right," Sarah said when they reached a spot where they couldn't be overheard. "I'm not just a medic, but I need you to understand that asking questions about my background could put a lot of people in danger, including your own team." "What kind of danger?" Mike asked, his SEAL instincts fully engaged now. "The kind that gets good soldiers killed because they know things they shouldn't know," Sarah replied. "I'm here on a classified assignment that has nothing to do with treating wounded SEALs, but treating wounded SEALs is what keeps my cover intact." Mike felt a chill despite the Afghan heat. "Cover for what?" Sarah looked out over the valley, where the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. For a moment she seemed younger than her medical expertise suggested, like she was carrying burdens that belonged to someone twice her age. "There are things happening in this region that your command structure doesn't know about yet," she said carefully. "Intelligence networks that need to be mapped. Threats that need to be neutralized before they can reach your teams in the field. My job is to gather information and coordinate with certain assets that officially don't exist." Mike processed this information, understanding now why Sarah's background was classified and why she had access to restricted areas. She was some kind of intelligence operative, possibly CIA or another agency that worked in the shadows behind military operations. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because you're not going to stop digging, and if you keep asking questions through normal channels, you're going to compromise an operation that's keeping your brothers alive," Sarah replied. "And because I might need your help before this is over." The next morning brought news that made Mike's stomach drop. Lieutenant Rodriguez gathered the remaining team members in the briefing tent, his face grim as he spread aerial photographs across the folding table. The images showed a compound in the mountains, roughly 20 kilometers from their current position, where intelligence suggested high-value targets were meeting to plan attacks on coalition forces. "We're going in tonight," Rodriguez announced, pointing to various features on the photos. "Fast insertion. Grab what intelligence we can and extract before dawn. The brass wants this one done quietly. No air support, no backup, just us." Mike studied the reconnaissance photos, noting the defensive positions and potential escape routes. It looked like a standard raid, the kind his team had executed dozens of times before. But something about the timing bothered him, coming so soon after his conversation with Sarah about classified operations in the region. "What's the intelligence source?" asked Petty Officer Collins, the team's communications specialist. "Need to know basis," Rodriguez replied, which was military speak for don't ask questions you can't get answers to. "But it comes from the highest levels. They want this compound hit hard and fast." As the briefing continued, Mike found his attention drifting to thoughts of Sarah Chen. She'd mentioned threats that command didn't know about yet, and intelligence networks that needed mapping. Could this mission be related to whatever operation she was running? The coincidence seemed too convenient to ignore. After the briefing ended and his teammates dispersed to prepare their equipment, Mike made his way to the medical tent. He found Sarah treating a soldier who'd twisted his ankle during a training exercise. Her gentle manner with the patient completely at odds with the dangerous operative he'd spoken with the day before. "Can I speak with you, privately?" Mike asked when she'd finished with the ankle injury. Sarah glanced around the tent, noting that they were alone except for Doc Peterson, who was busy with paperwork at the far end. She nodded toward a small supply room where they could talk without being overheard. "We're going out tonight," Mike said without preamble once they were behind closed doors. "A raid on a mountain compound. Do you know anything about it?" Sarah's expression shifted immediately. The casual demeanor of a base medic replaced by the sharp focus of an intelligence professional. "Tell me everything," she said. Mike described the mission details, the photographs, and the unusual secrecy surrounding the intelligence source. As he talked, he watched Sarah's face grow increasingly troubled, like she was putting together pieces of a puzzle that formed a picture she didn't like. "This is wrong," she said when he finished. "The compound you're describing was abandoned 3 weeks ago. I've been monitoring it as part of my operation, and there's been no activity there since the original occupants moved out." "Maybe they came back," Mike suggested, though he could feel doubt creeping into his voice. "No." Sarah shook her head firmly. "My sources would have detected any return to that location. If someone is sending your team there, they either have bad intelligence or they want you to walk into an empty building for reasons that have nothing to do with the stated mission." Mike felt cold dread settling in his chest. "You're saying this might be a trap?" "I'm saying it's not what it appears to be," Sarah replied. "And in my line of work, that usually means someone is about to get killed." They stared at each other for a moment, both understanding the implications. If Sarah was right, Mike's team was being sent on a mission based on false intelligence, which meant someone either wanted them out of the way or was using them as unwitting participants in a larger scheme. "I need to contact my handler," Sarah said, moving toward the door. "There might be time to stop this before your team deploys." "Wait," Mike grabbed her arm gently. "If you blow your cover now, you lose whatever operation you're running. And if I refuse to go on the mission without explaining why, that compromises you anyway." Sarah paused, recognizing the dilemma. In the world of covert operations, protecting ongoing missions often meant accepting casualties in the short term to prevent larger disasters later. But Mike could see the conflict in her eyes, the struggle between operational necessity and basic human decency. "There might be another way," she said slowly. "I could go with you." "Medical personnel don't go on combat raids," Mike pointed out. "They do when the mission commander specifically requests a medic for a high-risk operation," Sarah replied. "And I happen to know that Lieutenant Rodriguez has been considering asking for medical support ever since your team took casualties 3 days ago." Mike understood what she was suggesting. If Sarah could convince Rodriguez that the mission required a medic, she could accompany the team and provide protection if the operation turned out to be compromised. It was risky for both of them, but it might be the only way to prevent his brothers from walking into a trap. "Can you handle yourself in combat?" Mike asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer based on her familiarity with military equipment. Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd known her, and it wasn't the gentle expression of a caregiver. It was the cold, confident smile of a predator who'd been hunting dangerous game for years. "Sergeant Torres," she said, "I've been handling myself in combat since before you finished SEAL training. The question is whether you can keep up with me if things go sideways." An hour later, Mike watched as Sarah approached Lieutenant Rodriguez with a carefully crafted argument about medical support for the upcoming mission. She mentioned the team's recent casualties, the remote location that would make evacuation difficult, and the importance of having immediate medical care available if the raid encountered unexpected resistance. Rodriguez listened carefully, weighing the tactical advantages against the risk of bringing a non-combatant on a dangerous mission. Mike could see him considering the various factors, probably thinking about how he'd explain casualties to command if something went wrong without medical support available. "You understand this isn't a standard medical deployment," Rodriguez said finally. "We're going in fast and light, and there won't be time to protect non-combatants if we make contact with the enemy." "I understand completely," Sarah replied. "I've been in similar situations before, and I won't be a liability to the team." Something in her tone must have convinced Rodriguez because he nodded slowly. "All right, Doc Chen, you're with us. But you follow orders without question. And if I tell you to stay down, you stay down." "Yes, sir," Sarah said with the crisp acknowledgement of someone accustomed to following orders in dangerous situations. As Rodriguez walked away to finalize the mission preparations, Sarah caught Mike's eye and gave him a subtle nod. They were committed now, heading into unknown danger based on intelligence that might be compromised, with only each other to rely on if the situation went bad. Mike spent the rest of the afternoon checking and rechecking his equipment, cleaning his weapons and reviewing the mission parameters, but his mind kept returning to Sarah's warning about the abandoned compound and the possibility that someone was manipulating his team for purposes they couldn't yet understand. In a few hours, they'd find out whether her concerns were justified, and Mike couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would change everything. The helicopter lifted off at midnight, cutting through the darkness toward the mountain compound with no lights visible except the faint green glow of night vision equipment inside the cabin. Mike sat across from Sarah, noting how she'd transformed from the gentle medic he'd first met into someone who looked completely at home, surrounded by armed special operations soldiers. She'd equipped herself with body armor that fit too well to be borrowed, carried a sidearm with the casual familiarity of long practice, and moved through pre-mission checks like she'd done this hundreds of times before. The other team members had accepted her presence without question, probably assuming she was just another military medic doing her job. 2 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. Mike performed final weapons checks alongside his teammates, the familiar ritual helping calm his nerves despite the uncertainty surrounding their mission. Petty Officer Collins monitored radio frequencies for any signs of enemy activity, while Sergeant Williams reviewed the building layouts one more time through his night vision scope. As they approached the landing zone, Mike could see the compound through the helicopter's windows. It sat on a rocky plateau surrounded by steep cliffs exactly as the aerial photographs had shown. But something felt wrong about the whole scene, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what bothered him. The helicopter touched down softly in a clearing about half a kilometer from the target building. The team moved out quickly, spreading into a tactical formation as the aircraft lifted off and disappeared into the night sky. They were alone now in hostile territory, committed to completing their mission regardless of what they might find. Sarah stayed close to Mike as they approached the compound, moving with the fluid grace of someone trained in small unit tactics. She communicated through hand signals when necessary, proving she understood military communication protocols better than most actual soldiers. The building appeared exactly as described in their briefing, a 2-story stone structure with multiple entrances and defensive positions that could conceal enemy fighters. But as they drew closer, Mike realized what had been bothering him about the aerial view. There were no signs of recent habitation, no vehicle tracks, no light discipline measures, no evidence that anyone had been using this place for planning terrorist attacks. Lieutenant Rodriguez held up a closed fist, signaling the team to halt while he assessed the situation. Through his night vision equipment, Mike could see his commander studying the building with growing suspicion. Rodriguez was an experienced officer who'd conducted dozens of similar raids, and he clearly sensed the same wrongness that Mike felt. Sarah moved up beside Rodriguez and whispered something Mike couldn't hear. The lieutenant nodded grimly and adjusted their approach, directing the team to circle around to the rear of the building instead of taking the direct route they'd originally planned. As they repositioned, Mike caught Sarah's attention and gestured toward the empty compound with a questioning expression. She responded with subtle hand signals that confirmed his suspicions. The place had been abandoned for weeks, and there was no intelligence value to be found here. But if the compound was empty and the intelligence was false, why had they been sent here? The question gnawed at Mike as they moved into position around the building. Someone with high-level clearance had ordered this mission, based on information they knew to be incorrect, which meant the real purpose had nothing to do with gathering intelligence or capturing terrorist leaders. Rodriguez signaled for entry, and the team moved forward with practiced precision. They breached the main entrance while Collins and Williams covered potential escape routes, moving through the building room by room in standard clearing formation. Sarah followed close behind, ready to provide medical support if they encountered resistance. The compound was completely empty, just as Sarah had predicted. No weapons, no intelligence materials. No signs that anyone had been using the facility for operational planning. The rooms contained nothing but dust and abandoned furniture, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never arrive. "Something's wrong," Rodriguez muttered as they finished clearing the upper floor. "This place hasn't been occupied in months." Before anyone could respond, Collins's voice came through their radio communications with urgent intensity.
Contact, contact!
Multiple vehicles approaching from the east, approximately 2 kilometers out. Mike felt his blood turn to ice. If vehicles were approaching their position, it meant someone had known they would be here tonight. The mission wasn't based on bad intelligence. It was a deliberate setup, designed to put them in a specific location at a specific time. "How many vehicles?" Rodriguez demanded. "At least 4, possibly more," Collins replied. "Moving fast, looks like a coordinated approach." Sarah grabbed Mike's arm, her face grim in the green glow of his night vision equipment. "We need to get out of here now," she said. This isn't a coincidence. Rodriguez was already moving, directing the team toward their planned extraction point while calling for immediate helicopter pickup. But Mike could see the mathematics of their situation, and the numbers didn't look good. The approaching vehicles would reach their position before the helicopter could return, leaving them trapped in an isolated compound with limited ammunition and no cover. "There's another way out," Sarah said suddenly, pointing toward a section of the compound they hadn't fully explored. "Emergency exit through the cliff face. It's not on any of your maps, but I've seen the architectural surveys." Rodriguez looked skeptical, but the sound of approaching engines was getting louder. "Show me," he ordered. Sarah led them to what appeared to be a solid stone wall on the building's rear side. But when she manipulated a hidden mechanism, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a narrow tunnel carved into the rock face. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, but it led downward toward the valley below. "How did you know about this?" Rodriguez demanded. "Because I helped map this facility 3 months ago," Sarah replied, dropping the pretense of being just a medic, "and because someone clearly wanted your team trapped here tonight." The sound of vehicles was much closer now, and Mike could see headlights sweeping across the compound's perimeter. Whoever was coming had night vision equipment and military-grade weapons, which meant this wasn't a random patrol stumbling across their position. "Go," Rodriguez ordered, pushing his team toward the hidden passage. "Collins, call in our position and request immediate extraction at the alternate site." They moved through the tunnel single file, Sarah leading the way with the confidence of someone who'd studied these passages extensively. The narrow space forced them to move slowly, and Mike could hear vehicles arriving at the compound above them as they descended through the mountain. Behind them, the sound of boots on stone echoed through the building as their pursuers began searching for any sign of where the American team had gone. Mike wondered how long it would take them to find the hidden passage, and whether his team could reach safety before they were discovered. As they emerged from the tunnel into a small cave overlooking the valley, Sarah pulled out communication equipment that definitely wasn't standard medical corps issue. She spoke rapidly in a language Mike didn't recognize, coordinating with contacts who were clearly part of whatever operation she'd been running. "Extraction in 15 minutes, she announced. "But we need to move to a different pickup point. The one your command designated is probably compromised too." Rodriguez stared at her for a moment, finally understanding that their medic was something far more dangerous and valuable than she'd pretended to be. "Who are you really?" he asked. "Someone who's been trying to keep teams like yours alive," Sarah replied, "and someone who just saved your lives by being here tonight." The helicopter that picked them up 20 minutes later wasn't one of their regular transport aircraft. This was a sleek, modified Black Hawk with no visible markings and a crew who communicated only through hand signals. Mike realized they were being extracted by whatever agency Sarah really worked for, which meant their rescue came with complications that would follow them back to base. Sarah sat beside him during the flight, no longer bothering to maintain her cover as a simple medic. She coordinated with the flight crew through sophisticated communication equipment and spoke in code phrases that suggested a level of clearance far above anything a military medical officer would possess. "We're not going back to Kandahar," she told Rodriguez, over the aircraft's intercom. "Your base has been compromised, and returning there would put your entire unit at risk." "Compromised how?" Rodriguez demanded, his patience with mysteries finally wearing thin. "Someone with access to your mission planning fed information to hostile forces," Sarah explained. "They knew exactly where you'd be tonight and when you'd be there. If we hadn't used the emergency exit, your team would be dead or captured right now. Mike felt sick as the implications sank in. Someone within their own command structure had deliberately sent them into a trap, using classified intelligence to set up an ambush that would eliminate an entire SEAL team. The betrayal felt personal, like being stabbed by a brother. "Where are you taking us?" Collins asked, studying the darkness outside the helicopter windows. "Secure facility where you can be debriefed safely," Sarah replied. "My superiors need to understand exactly how this operation was compromised before we can determine who to trust." The aircraft flew for another hour before landing at what appeared to be an abandoned airfield in the middle of nowhere. But Mike's trained eye caught details that revealed the true nature of their destination. Hidden security cameras, concealed defensive positions, and landing lights that had been carefully shielded to avoid detection by satellite surveillance. They were escorted into an underground facility that looked more like a high-tech bunker than a military installation. The corridors were lined with sophisticated monitoring equipment, and the personnel they encountered wore civilian clothes instead of military uniforms. Mike began to understand that Sarah worked for an intelligence agency that operated parallel to normal military command structures. The debriefing room contained a conference table surrounded by individuals who introduced themselves only by first names. Sarah sat at the head of the table, her transformation from battlefield medic to intelligence operative now complete. She wore different clothes, tactical pants, and a fitted shirt that accommodated concealed weapons, and her entire demeanor radiated the authority of someone accustomed to running dangerous operations. "Gentlemen," she began, addressing the SEAL team with professional courtesy, "I apologize for the deception, but your lives depended on maintaining my cover until tonight. I'm Agent Sarah Chen, Defense Intelligence Agency, and I've been investigating security breaches that have compromised multiple special operations units over the past 6 months." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, processing this information with the careful attention of an experienced officer. "How many other teams have been affected?" 12 confirmed incidents, Sarah replied. "Teams sent on missions based on false intelligence, usually resulting in casualties or capture. Tonight was the first time we were able to intervene directly and prevent the trap from succeeding." Mike thought about the friends he'd lost over the past year, wondering how many had died because someone had deliberately sent them into ambushes. The anger building in his chest felt white-hot, focused on whoever was betraying American soldiers for money or ideology. "Do you know who's responsible?" Williams asked. "We have strong suspicions," said one of Sarah's colleagues, a middle-aged man who'd introduced himself as Director Hayes. "But we need more evidence before we can move against individuals at that level of the command structure." "What level are we talking about?" Rodriguez pressed. Hayes exchanged a glance with Sarah before responding. "High enough to access classified mission planning across multiple units. Someone with the authority to modify intelligence reports and alter operational parameters without triggering normal oversight mechanisms." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. They weren't dealing with a low-level security breach or careless handling of classified information. This was a deliberate conspiracy involving someone with significant power within the military hierarchy. "Why use me as medical cover?" Mike asked Sarah directly. "You could have found other ways to monitor our operations." "Because medical personnel have access to wounded soldiers who might have information about how their missions were compromised," Sarah explained. "I've been documenting patterns in the casualties, trying to understand how the intelligence leaks correlate with specific types of operations." "And what did you find?" Sarah activated a wall-mounted display that showed a map of Afghanistan with various locations marked in different colors. Red dots indicated successful ambushes of American forces, while yellow dots showed missions that had been canceled or modified at the last minute. "The pattern becomes clear when you look at it geographically and chronologically," she said, using a laser pointer to highlight specific clusters. "Someone has been systematically targeting special operations units conducting sensitive missions in areas where we're tracking high-value terrorist assets." Mike studied the display, noting how the red dots formed corridors that corresponded to known smuggling routes and terrorist safe havens. "They're protecting specific areas," he realized. "Someone doesn't want us operating in those regions." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "And the timing suggests they're coordinating with hostile forces to ensure American casualties when teams get too close to something important." Director Hayes stood up from his chair, moving to stand beside the map display. "We believe the compromised intelligence is being used to protect a major terrorist operation that's been in planning for months. Every time one of our teams gets close to discovering it, they're eliminated or diverted through false mission parameters." "What kind of operation?" Rodriguez asked. "We're not certain yet," Hayes admitted. "But the level of coordination required to compromise this many missions suggests something significant enough to justify infiltrating our command structure." Sarah turned away from the map to address the SEAL team directly. "This is where you come in. Your team was specifically targeted tonight, which means you were getting close to something they wanted to protect. We need to understand what that was." Mike thought back through their recent missions, trying to identify what might have made them a threat worth eliminating. They'd conducted standard raids and reconnaissance operations. Nothing that seemed particularly significant in the larger context of the war. "The Helmand Province operation last month," Collins said suddenly. "We found communications equipment that our intelligence guys said was more sophisticated than usual Taliban gear." "What kind of equipment?" Sarah asked, suddenly very interested. "Satellite communication system, military-grade encryption, stuff that would cost more than most terrorist cells could afford," Collins replied. "But when we tried to follow up on the intelligence, we got orders to focus on other targets." Sarah and Hayes exchanged meaningful looks across the conference table. "That communication equipment was part of a larger network we've been trying to map," Sarah said. "If your team discovered a node in that network, it would explain why someone wanted you eliminated before you could investigate further." The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a picture of a conspiracy much larger than Mike had initially imagined. Someone within their own military was protecting a sophisticated terrorist communication network, using compromised intelligence to eliminate American forces who got too close to the truth. "What happens now?" Rodriguez asked. "Now we use you as bait," Sarah replied with a grim smile. "Because whoever tried to kill you tonight is going to try again, and when they do, we'll be ready for them." The plan Sarah and her team developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Mike's SEAL team would return to their base with a cover story about the failed mission, claiming they'd found the compound empty and extracted without making contact with enemy forces. Meanwhile, Sarah would resume her role as a medic, but with sophisticated surveillance equipment, monitoring every interaction and communication. The person feeding intelligence to hostile forces will need to know why the ambush failed, Sarah explained as they prepared to return to forward operating base Kandahar. They'll either try to gather information directly or arrange for another attempt to eliminate your team. Mike didn't like the idea of using his brothers as bait in a counterintelligence operation, but he understood the mathematics of war. If they didn't identify the traitor, other American soldiers would continue dying in carefully orchestrated ambushes. Sometimes the only way to stop a predator was to make yourself visible enough to draw them out. The helicopter flight back to base felt surreal, like returning from a dream where everything familiar had been revealed as deception. Mike looked at his teammates differently now, wondering if any of them suspected how close they'd come to dying, or how their trusted command structure had been infiltrated by someone willing to trade American lives for unknown compensation. Sarah sat across from him during the flight, back in her medical corps uniform and carrying the gentle expression he'd first encountered in the field hospital. But now Mike could see through the disguise to the dangerous operative beneath, someone who'd spent months building an identity that could withstand scrutiny from trained soldiers. "When we get back," she said quietly, "everything returns to normal. You treat your wounds, I treat my patients, and we pretend last night never happened. But if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you find a way to let me know immediately." They landed at Kandahar just after dawn, with the cover story already prepared and rehearsed. Lieutenant Rodriguez filed his mission report, describing an empty compound and negative intelligence that suggested the original information had been outdated. It was a plausible enough scenario that wouldn't raise suspicions about why they'd survived when they should have been killed. Mike returned to light duty, though his leg wound provided a convenient excuse to spend time around the medical facility, where he could observe Sarah's interactions with base personnel. He watched as she resumed treating patients with the same gentle competence he'd first witnessed, giving no sign that she'd spent the night conducting covert operations and planning counterintelligence strategies. But Mike noticed things now that he'd missed before. The way Sarah positioned herself to observe everyone who entered the medical tent. How she asked seemingly casual questions about personnel changes and mission schedules. The subtle way she documented information that had nothing to do with medical treatment. 3 days passed without incident, and Mike began to wonder if their trap would work. Maybe whoever had tried to eliminate his team would wait before making another attempt, or perhaps they'd decided the failed ambush was simply bad luck, rather than a security breach. Then Sergeant Williams approached Mike during morning PT with news that made his blood run cold. "We're going out again tonight," Williams said, keeping his voice low, despite being surrounded by other soldiers going through their exercise routines. "Another high-priority target similar to the last one. Who authorized it?" Mike asked, though he already suspected the answer would lead them deeper into the conspiracy. "Came down from division level," Williams replied. "Rodriguez tried to argue that we needed more recovery time after the casualties last week. But apparently this intelligence is time-sensitive." Mike felt the familiar dread settling in his chest. Someone was sending them on another mission, designed to eliminate witnesses to the communication network they'd discovered in Helmand Province. The failed ambush had apparently only delayed the execution, not prevented it. He found Sarah in the supply room behind the medical tent, ostensibly organizing medical equipment but actually monitoring radio, communications through sophisticated surveillance. "Gear she kept hidden among the legitimate supplies there, sending us out again," he told her without preamble. Sarah's hands paused in their inventory work, and Mike saw her jaw tighten with controlled anger. "How soon?" "Tonight. Another mountain compound, another high-value intelligence target, and another carefully planned ambush," Sarah finished grimly. "Whoever's running this operation doesn't give up easily." She turned to face him fully, and Mike could see her mind working through tactical considerations and operational constraints. "This time we're going to be ready for them. But it means revealing my cover to your entire team, which could compromise months of investigation. Better than letting my brothers die for someone else's conspiracy," Mike replied. Sarah nodded, understanding that they'd reached the point where protecting the investigation mattered less than protecting lives. "All right. Gather your team somewhere private where we can't be overheard or observed. It's time they learned what they're really fighting against." An hour later, Mike's SEAL team assembled in a maintenance shed that provided privacy from both visual and electronic surveillance. Sarah arrived carrying a briefcase that contained equipment far more sophisticated than anything a field medic should possess. "Gentlemen," she began, dropping her medical persona completely, "what I'm about to tell you will probably save your lives, but it will also make you targets for the rest of this deployment." She opened the briefcase to reveal surveillance equipment, classified documents, and photographs that painted a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy they'd stumbled into. Communication intercepts showed coordination between American personnel and known terrorist contacts. Financial records revealed payments flowing through accounts linked to military contractors. Mission reports documented patterns of compromised operations dating back 6 months. "Someone within our command structure has been systematically betraying special operations teams," Sarah explained, laying out the evidence piece by piece. "The goal appears to be protecting a sophisticated terrorist communication network while eliminating American forces who might discover it." Rodriguez studied the documents with the careful attention of an officer trained to evaluate intelligence reports. "How high does this go?" "High enough to access classified mission planning across multiple units," Sarah replied. "We've identified at least 3 individuals with the clearance and access necessary to modify intelligence reports and operational parameters." She activated a tablet computer that displayed personnel files for the suspected conspirators. Mike recognized 2 of the names from briefings he'd attended, senior officers with access to the highest levels of classified information. "Tonight's mission is designed to finish what last week's ambush failed to accomplish," Sarah continued. "But this time we're going to turn the trap around on them." Collins leaned forward in his chair, studying the tactical display Sarah had created on her tablet. "What do you need from us?" "I need you to go on the mission exactly as planned," Sarah said, "but with modifications that will let us identify and capture whoever is coordinating with hostile forces to set up these ambushes." She outlined a plan that would use their mission as bait to draw out the conspiracy. while positioning additional assets to document the coordination between American personnel and terrorist contacts. It was risky, requiring Mike's team to knowingly walk into danger while trusting that Sarah's backup plan would keep them alive. If this goes wrong, Williams pointed out, we're all dead, and the conspiracy continues operating. If we don't try, Sarah replied, other teams will continue dying until someone else figures out what we've discovered. And there's no guarantee they'll be as lucky as you were last week. Mike looked around at his teammates, seeing the same grim determination in their faces that he felt in his own chest. They were SEALs, trained to accept impossible missions and find ways to accomplish them despite overwhelming odds. We're in, Rodriguez said finally. But if this goes sideways, you better have a plan to get us out. Sarah smiled, and once again it wasn't the gentle expression of a caregiver. Sergeant Torres, she said, getting people out of impossible situations is what I do for a living. The mission launched exactly as planned at midnight, with Mike's team boarding their transport helicopter under the watchful eyes of base personnel, who had no idea they were witnessing the culmination of a months-long counterintelligence operation. Sarah sat among them in her medic gear, but this time she carried additional equipment, concealed within her medical supplies, surveillance devices, that would record everything that happened during the ambush. The target compound was located in a different mountain valley, but the tactical situation felt eerily similar to the previous week's trap. Isolated location, difficult terrain for extraction, and intelligence reports that claimed high-value targets would be present at a specific time. Mike could practically feel the crosshairs settling on his team as they approached the landing zone. But this time, they weren't flying into the trap alone. Sarah's colleagues from the Defense Intelligence Agency had positioned surveillance teams throughout the valley, equipped with long-range cameras and communication intercept equipment that would document exactly how their enemies coordinated the ambush. Hidden observers would record everything, providing evidence that could finally expose the conspiracy. 2 minutes out, the pilot announced, his voice steady despite flying into what everyone aboard knew was a carefully prepared killing zone. Mike checked his weapons one final time, noting that his teammates showed the controlled tension of professionals preparing for combat. They knew was coming. Collins monitored radio frequencies for any premature signs of enemy activity, while Williams and Rodriguez reviewed their modified tactical plan that would keep them alive long enough for the surveillance operation to succeed. Sarah sat quietly beside Mike, no longer bothering to maintain her cover as an anxious medic. She wore the calm expression of someone who'd orchestrated similar operations before, someone confident that her planning would prove superior to whatever trap awaited them. The helicopter touched down in the designated landing zone, and Mike's team deployed into the night with practiced efficiency. They moved toward the target compound following their assigned route, while Sarah's hidden surveillance teams documented everything through night vision equipment and satellite communications. As they approached the building, Mike's radio earpiece crackled with a voice he didn't immediately recognize. Overwatch 1 to ground team, we have multiple heat signatures moving to surround your position. Estimate 20+ hostiles with military equipment. That was Sarah's voice, he realized, speaking from whatever command post she'd established to coordinate the surveillance operation. She was watching everything unfold through remote cameras while maintaining radio contact with both his team and her agency colleagues. Copy that, Overwatch, Rodriguez replied quietly. Ground team is proceeding to target building as planned. They reached the compound and began their approach, knowing that hostile forces were moving into position to eliminate them. But instead of feeling trapped, Mike experienced the strange calm that came with finally understanding the full scope of what they were fighting against. Tonight would end the conspiracy one way or another. Ground team, this is Overwatch. Sarah's voice came through their communications again. We're intercepting radio traffic between hostile forces and someone using American military encryption codes. Recording everything for evidence. That was the key piece they'd been waiting for. Proof that someone within their own command structure was actively coordinating with enemy forces to target American soldiers. Mike felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that whoever had betrayed them was finally about to be exposed. The ambush began exactly as expected, with hostile forces emerging from concealed positions around the compound to surround Mike's team with overwhelming firepower. But instead of trying to fight their way out, the SEALs implemented their modified plan, taking defensive positions that would keep them alive while Sarah's surveillance teams documented the coordination between American and enemy forces. Overwatch to all stations. Sarah's voice cut through the sound of gunfire. We have positive identification of the source. American personnel are providing real-time tactical updates to hostile forces. Through his night vision equipment, Mike could see muzzle flashes surrounding their position as enemy fighters closed in for what should have been the final phase of their trap. But suddenly the incoming fire began to slack off as confusion spread through the hostile ranks. What's happening? Collins asked over their tactical radio. The cavalry has arrived, Sarah replied, and Mike could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Additional helicopters appeared overhead, deploying teams that engaged the hostile forces from unexpected directions. These weren't regular military units. They moved with the coordinated precision of special operations teams, hitting the enemy positions with overwhelming force while carefully avoiding Mike's defensive position. Within minutes, the ambush had been turned completely around. Enemy fighters who'd expected to eliminate a trapped SEAL team instead found themselves caught between two forces with superior training and equipment. Those who survived the initial assault quickly surrendered or attempted to flee into the mountains. Ground team, this is Overwatch, Sarah announced. Area is secure. Helicopter extraction inbound for immediate departure. As they waited for pickup, Mike watched Sarah's colleagues process the prisoners and evidence they'd captured during the operation. Several of the enemy fighters carried American-made communication equipment, while others had detailed intelligence about SEAL team tactics and equipment that could only have come from military sources. The helicopter ride back to the DIA facility felt completely different from their previous extraction. This time they were returning as victors rather than survivors, carrying evidence that would finally expose the conspiracy that had cost so many American lives. Sarah sat across from Mike during the flight, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully completed a difficult mission. It's over, she said simply. We have everything we need to identify and arrest everyone involved in the conspiracy. Back at the secure facility, Mike's team watched as Sarah's superiors reviewed the intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations that revealed the full scope of the betrayal. 3 senior military officers had been systematically compromising special operations missions in exchange for payments from terrorist organizations. Their goal had been to protect a sophisticated communication network that coordinated attacks throughout the region. What happens to them? Rodriguez asked as they reviewed the evidence. Military tribunal followed by life imprisonment if they're lucky. Director Hayes replied grimly. Treason during wartime carries the death penalty. Mike felt a deep satisfaction knowing that the people responsible for betraying American soldiers would face justice for their crimes. But he also realized that Sarah's investigation had prevented much larger casualties and that the communication network they'd protected was being used to coordinate a major terrorist attack that would have killed hundreds of civilians. What about you? Mike asked Sarah as the briefing session ended. Do you go back to pretending to be a medic? Sarah smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was the genuine expression of someone who'd completed a mission that mattered. No more pretending, she said. My cover was blown the moment we exposed the conspiracy. But I think I'm ready to go back to doing the job I was trained for. Which is? Hunting down people who think they can betray American soldiers and get away with it, Sarah replied. It turns out I have a talent for it. Mike nodded, understanding that some people were meant for dangerous work that saved lives by eliminating threats others never even knew existed. Sarah Chen was one of those people, someone who'd chosen to fight shadows so that soldiers like his teammates could focus on the enemies they could see. 6 months later, Mike received a letter forwarded through military channels. It contained no return address and only a few lines of text. The network is completely dismantled. 47 American lives saved through the intelligence we gathered. Thank you for trusting someone who couldn't tell you who she really was. It was signed simply SC, but Mike knew exactly who had sent it. Somewhere in the world, Sarah Chen was still fighting the kind of wars that happened in darkness, protecting soldiers who would never know her name or understand the sacrifices she'd made to keep them alive. And Mike Torres, fully healed and back to active duty with his SEAL team, knew that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people who remained wounded, but wordless, carrying secrets that could never be shared, but always made the difference between life and death for those they protected.